and liability concerns, however.
Good afternoon, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion House, New Mexico, working on oil painting nurture.
For a full day after their participation.
Okay, there's still some broad strokes, technicalities that I need to adjust before I can start digging into the details of each scene. Firstly, I'm going to lay in a bright yellow glow across the horizon of the mountains, with a very thin line tapering up into the sky, very thin. And then I have a bright, or a slightly brighter, ultramarine, cerulean, and violet mixture for the shadow side of the trees, and I want to just emphasize the variation in tone on the dark side. And then we'll see how much time we have after that. The simple line across the mountain could take a little bit longer than anticipated. We'll see. Here we go.
Finally, they wanted volunteers to submit urine samples for testing for drugs of abuse. Within a month, on February 19, 1989, the research center approved the DMT protocol. They also agreed to fund my request for testing hormone levels and for developing a method of measuring DMT in human blood. 3 days later, the Human Research Ethics Committee also approved the study. I then began looking for a source of DMT. At the same time, I had to make sure it was legal for me to possess it once I found it. The simpler of these two tasks was possession, and this depended on the DEA providing me a Schedule I permit. In April 1989, I met with the University Hospital Pharmacy about the security requirements the DEA would request for storing a Schedule I drug. Since the pharmacists previously had worked on a marijuana study, they believed their safeguards were adequate. I sent in my DEA Schedule I permit application. It stated that the permit was necessary to possess laboratory-grade DMT, so we could begin developing a way to measure DMT in human blood. Later, the permit would need to cover the human-grade DMT volunteers would receive. This human-grade DMT needed to be purer than that required for laboratory work. Giving people DMT would not begin until the FDA approved the study and the purity of the human-grade drug. One section of the DEA application asked for DMT's drug number. I called the DEA office in Washington, D.C., and a staff person looked up DMT on the list of national drug codes. This number went into the appropriate box. I called the DEA 2 weeks later, but they had no record of receiving my application. The person with whom I spoke said, "We're moving into a new office and everything's in boxes." Another 2 weeks passed. Still no record of my request. In a few days, though, I received the entire application back. They needed the correct drug number for DMT. This number was on a sheet of paper they enclosed with the returned application. The person with whom I had spoken earlier had given me the wrong number. I entered the correct number and mailed back the revised application that day. The DEA also wanted a New Mexico Board of Pharmacy Schedule I permit. I applied for and received this certificate within a few weeks. "It's all up to the DEA," the staff at the New Mexico Board said. The DEA then told me they would approve the request for laboratory-grade DMT if the hospital pharmacy and staff passed necessary security checks. The paperwork went from Washington to Denver, and from Denver to Albuquerque. The local Albuquerque DEA field officer, Agent D, came to the university to meet me and look over the pharmacy in early June of 1989. She asked for the names of all those pharmacy staff who might have contact with the DMT, as well as our addresses, phone numbers, and social security numbers. She found several breaches in security and asked us to get a locked freezer. That freezer was to be placed in the locked narcotics vault. She said I could not have a copy of the freezer key. Only the hospital pharmacists should. If any of the drug ended up missing, they didn't want to suspect me of stealing it. She had the unsettling habit of joking every so often. "Well, that won't land you in jail, and don't worry, we won't take you away in handcuffs for that." I tried to laugh with her. When we said goodbye that day, she summed it up. "It's your ass on the line. If anything goes wrong, theft, loss, bad record keeping, we look to you for explanations." As anxious as her visit made me feel, Agent D's last words were the most troubling. "By the way, where will you get the DMT you'll give to your volunteers?" Later that month, the DEA approved in principle my request for permission to possess laboratory-grade DMT. I promised not to give this lower-grade drug to volunteers and would await FDA approval on human-grade DMT before starting the study. The DEA still held control over whether I could possess human-grade DMT because this was to be a different batch of drug. In March 1989, within a week of obtaining university approvals for the DMT study, and just after mailing in my forms to the DEA, I called Sigma Laboratories in St. Louis, Missouri. Sigma was the chemical supply house that had provided melatonin for my human pineal project. There was a listing for DMT in their catalog, and I asked if they would sell some to me. I requested laboratory-grade DMT for our efforts to measure DMT in body fluids. I also asked for clinical-grade drug for human use. Sigma told me that there was no problem in purchasing laboratory-grade DMT. The only requirement was a Schedule I permit from the DEA. Obtaining human-grade DMT was going to be more complicated, as it called for Sigma putting together specific documentation for the FDA, a drug master file. Sigma recommended contacting the investigators who administered DMT to humans in previous studies to find out who had supplied them. Sigma then would know how much detail to provide the FDA. If there were problems finding out who used to have those files, they recommended utilizing the U.S. Freedom of Information Act. This law allows citizens to request privileged information as long as it does not threaten American national security interests. I obtained a list of all the currently active investigational drug permits in the country so that I could contact anyone who possessed one for DMT. Unfortunately, there weren't any. My request to find out about the existence of old permits using the Freedom of Information Act was not successful. There were no records or files at the FDA for previous DMT permits. My application to give DMT to humans went into the FDA in late April. I asked for a reactivation of the old DMT permits that the first generation of researchers had used, hoping the FDA itself might be able to find those old hidden files. One of the scientists who had given humans DMT, a co-author of the Decent Burial paper, agreed to let the FDA look at his old records on my behalf. However, in later correspondence, he discovered he had no information about the drug and couldn't remember who had been his supplier. He wished me good luck. In early May, the FDA sent their first letter, signed by Ms. P, advising that if they didn't get in touch within a month, the study could proceed. Of course, I had no DMT. However, they now had the application, and my request received a file number. Sigma now agreed to discuss with the FDA putting together a drug master file for me. In June, Ms. P at the FDA said Sigma was not providing them enough information about how their DMT was made. Sigma replied that their European DMT supplier refused to release any such information. It was a trade secret. Sigma also was concerned that the FDA was asking for more information about DMT than they did for other drugs Sigma previously had provided for human studies. Sigma gave me the name of the FDA chemist assigned to my application, Ms. R. She and I were to carry on dozens of conversations over the next year and a half. I asked Ms. R why the FDA was requiring more information about DMT than they did about melatonin from my previous research. She replied, "It's case by case." Sigma complained that the FDA was being unreasonable. The FDA wouldn't move forward until they had more information. When I asked Ms. R if she knew who was Sigma's supplier, saying that I wished to contact them directly myself, she offered their name. When I asked Sigma to confirm this, they were upset by what they felt was a breach of confidence. Nevertheless, they agreed to send the FDA all the information they possessed about their DMT. I asked Ms. R, if Sigma's DMT doesn't have all the necessary manufacturing data, could I purify it so it meets your requirements? She doubted it. The director of the division within the FDA where she worked before was the fellow who told me at the brain science meeting some years back, the dying have rights too. He had blocked all requests by previous researchers to purify laboratory-grade drugs in order to give them to humans. Maybe it's different now, she said. This is a new division with new directors. This was true. The rising tide of AIDS and drug abuse brought into focus the delays in the drug approval process at the FDA. A new division formed to provide expedited review of new drugs for these problems. Fortunately, my DMT request went to this new division rather than Dr. L's, where my MDMA proposal never made any progress. Several months passed, and Ms. R never did receive any information from Sigma. Sigma felt that the FDA had broken confidentiality, and they probably did not want to get any deeper into what they knew would be a long and complicated process. What was in it for them? I gave up hoping to obtain Sigma's DMT for human use. A densely worded letter arrived from the FDA in August 1989, spelling out 20 separate requirements the human-grade DMT must meet. There were no questions about general toxicity, which would require complicated and expensive animal testing. Nor were there concerns about the study's scientific merit. On those counts, in any event, I was encouraged. I called the chemist colleague who previously had offered his dire prediction about my only publication being one on the failure to obtain permission to run the study. I asked him directly, "Will you make me some DMT?" He declined. He did not believe his current laboratory would meet the requirements to qualify as a manufacturer. It would be too expensive and time-consuming to try. I also asked David Nichols, PhD, a chemist and pharmacologist at Purdue University in Indiana. He recommended Dr. K at the National Institute of Mental Health, who directed a program that made hard-to-find research drugs. Dr. K said his contract prohibited use of his compounds in humans, although perhaps in the future he might request to synthesize human-grade drugs. Dr. K recommended calling Lou G, an old colleague at a chemical supply house in Chicago. As it turned out, Lou, who stayed on after another firm bought his company, had provided much of the DMT for American human studies. However, his Chicago firm did not give those researchers any manufacturing or animal toxicity data. Lou laughed on the phone as he said, "We just told them it was pure, 95% more or less. Things were a lot looser then." I wrote to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, NIDA, asking if they had some human-grade DMT. When a month elapsed, I wrote again. Mr. W replied and said NIDA drugs usually came from a laboratory in North Carolina. Dr. C directed this group. I called Dr. C, who told me they could not make human-grade drugs. When reminded of a recently published study in which his laboratory did so for another research project, he said he'd look into it. Even if he did agree to make the drug, he wouldn't put the drug master file together for the FDA. He said, "I don't want the liability. I don't have insurance for human use. It's not in my contract." Dr. C recommended getting some DMT from NIDA and purifying it to the required 99.5% purity. He thought they might have 5 grams or so on the shelf. When asked about this, Mr. W answered, "Our DMT is too old. and we don't have any manufacturing data. He continued, we've got a contract with Dr. C. They make what we ask them. There's another laboratory that prepares their drugs for human use. I think the bigger issue is that there is not a lot of movement on DMT these days. It wouldn't be very cost-effective for us to use much money from our contract for such an obscure drug. Let me see what I can find out. A few weeks later, Mr. W called back, saying Dr. C could make DMT, but I would have to pay for it. Dr. C agreed to calculate an estimate, but repeated that he would not put together the required drug file for FDA. It's too much work. This seemed minimally promising. When I asked Ms. R at the FDA about putting together my own drug file on Dr. C's DMT, she said she'd get back to me. If Dr. C made the DMT, could I really use it? I'll check with the drug abuse staff here, she answered. Why wouldn't I be able to? She answered, I don't know. Maybe our director, Dr. H, will call you. Dr. C's estimate of the cost was over $50,000. Well, I said, thanks for looking into it. Another door closed. I called Ms. R. I'm not having much luck. What do you suggest? I'll go to the Federal Archives building and see if I can find the previous DMT researchers' files. In July 1989, Ms. R found the files for these old studies. The data in them are terrible, she said. There's nothing. No animal data, no chemistry data. We closed it. They never responded to our requests for progress reports. It won't help you. How did you ever approve that study? I don't know. I didn't work here then. She tried sounding hopeful. I'll send the information you need to set up your own drug file. The information she sent was designed for a large drug company such as Lilly, Merck, or Pfizer. It had nothing to do with an individual investigator. I called Ms. R. I need help. Why aren't you helping me? Our director's name is Dr. H. Here's his phone number. Insist on speaking with him. I called Dr. H's office. Dr. H's secretary said, you'll need to speak to Dr. W. Before I could protest, he transferred the call to Dr. W. This is Dr. W, boomed the friendly but commanding voice on the other end of the line. I'm the only physician on the drug abuse staff in this new division. I know what you've been going through. We're here to help. Don't despair. How can I get human-grade DMT? I asked. Find someone to make it for you. How about Dave Nichols at Purdue? He replied, that's possible. Could you and Dave talk with each other? Have Dr. Nichols write to the director, Dr. H. Here's his address. The name of the staff working on your request is Ms. M. Call her in 2 weeks. I felt something shift with that phone conversation. I called Dave Nichols. He quoted me a price of $300, just the cost of supplies. While all these calls were taking place, I knew that funding from outside the university was crucial for the project to gain all the legitimacy it needed. Additional financial support also would free up my time to find human-grade DMT and help the research center pay for some of the work I requested. This, in turn, would increase the research center's backing of the protocol. In looking over some of the old DMT and schizophrenia research, it appeared that the Scottish Rite Foundation, a branch of the Freemasons, had funded some of it through their schizophrenia research program. I asked this program to send an application for funding. My DMT proposal already discussed the importance of understanding DMT's effects in its possible role as an endogenous schizotoxin. Therefore, it took little work to modify the grant to emphasize these issues more clearly. I wrote Dr. Friedman, telling him of my grant submission to the Scottish Rite Foundation. He replied that he was on their scientific review committee, and maybe they would fund a year's support. Within a month, in September 1989, a notification of award arrived announcing a 1-year grant for the project. I again wrote Dr. Friedman, updating him on the search for human-grade DMT. He scribbled a note on my letter and sent a copy of it to the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, one of his former students. His telegraphic missive ended, "Strassman needs someone at NIDA responsive. Any suggestions?" In September, I called Mr. W. at NIDA. He had just returned from a meeting with Dr. C. They were discussing how to get Schedule I drugs to researchers. "We want to help," he said. "Call Ms. B at the DEA and see if she can tell you how to get approval for Dr. Nichols to make a small batch for you. If the amount is too large, he'll need to be a legally designated manufacturer and will never be able to afford the required security." I called Ms. B. "Can Dave Nichols make some human-grade DMT for my project?" She began, "Well, if Dr. Nichols is going to be a manufacturer, he needs to meet rather stringent security requirements. Is there a DEA office near his university? They could drop over and tell him what he needs to do. Then Dr. Nichols could decide if he's able to meet their recommendations." I heard the edge start creeping into my voice. I was alarmed at how close I felt to losing it. "I've looked everywhere for human-grade DMT. Sigma and another chemical supply house, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the National Institute of Mental Health, former investigators, Dr. C in North Carolina. Dave Nichols is willing to make some for me, incredibly cheap. He needs your okay. I've got an outside grant and the research center at the university is behind this project. I'm losing my mind. I'm pulling out my hair. My gums are bleeding. I'm getting on my wife's nerves." There was a pause. I heard what sounded like her pushing her chair away from the desk. "Oh," she said, sounding genuinely concerned. "Let me see here. Yes, there's a coincidental activities clause in the regulations. Dr. Nichols can make a small batch if you're collaborating. This won't require any additional security for his laboratory." I heard her pull a large book out from somewhere. "It's acceptable for him to make it," and she started reading some text. "If and to the extent set forth." She spoke too quickly for me to write down the information. Ms. B finished. "Have Dr. Nichols write me. Here's my address. He'll need to amend his current permits, saying how much DMT he'll make. I'll check with our pharmacist to be certain it's a reasonable amount." "Okay," I said. "That sounds great. I really appreciate your help." I called Dr. W. He confided that, off the record, my project was pointing out a flaw in the drug laws. How do researchers study drugs of abuse? He then described exactly how to respond to the 20 requirements the FDA had written about in the 4-page letter that had arrived from them several months earlier. These steps would provide the FDA.
All right, yeah, that took almost a full session to lay down that yellow. And for anybody listening in the background there, that is Rick Strassman's audio book on my channel, DMT, the Spirit Molecule. Amazing process he had to go through in order to get this thing rolling. Pretty fascinating stuff. So I'm going to cut it here and pick up with a second take for the tree shadow purple. Coming up, take two.
The DEA also required verification from the FDA
Take
that
two.
Dave could go ahead and make the drug. 4 months later, in January 1990, Dave finally received DEA approval to make the DMT. He ordered the precursors immediately and began working on it. In the meantime, I had gotten laboratory quality DMT from Sigma and put it into the special locked freezer in the narcotics vault in the hospital pharmacy. 100 milligrams, 1/10 of a gram, in a little vial. The research center began developing a method to measure DMT in human blood. In addition, I received a high score from NIDA for a grant application to actually run the DMT study, and it was likely to be funded. 2 grants approved, but no drug. It was bizarre. Everyone wanted the study done, but no one knew how to get me the drug necessary to perform it. By February, the DEA had obtained enough information from the FDA to know that the protocol was sound enough for the FDA to approve in principle. The DEA agreed to give me the Schedule I permit. However, my contact there, Ms. L, called with some bad news. Diversion control blocked the permit. Who's diversion control? I asked. I'll try and get your request exempted. I'll call you next week. The next day, Ms. B from the DEA, the woman who had broken the log jam, called to say that Dave was indeed a manufacturer and would need additional security requirements. I didn't know what to say. I told her, I don't know what to say. Here's the name and phone number of the DEA agent in Indianapolis, near Purdue University. He's responsible for that area. He'll tell Dr. Nichols what he needs to do. She called back that day. I'm sorry. Dr. Nichols is making another drug, and we mixed up that one with your DMT request. My error. You may go ahead as you were planning. Dave called later that week, saying the lawyers at Purdue were advising him not to make the DMT because of liability issues. I called Mr. W at NIDA and asked him if there were ever any malpractice claims resulting from studies using their Schedule I drugs. He offered some encouraging news. We'd never been sued for providing marijuana, a Schedule I drug, for human research. Just make sure you've got an airtight informed consent document. He called back that day and put the NIDA attorney on the phone. The attorney said, you'd be sued first, then your university, then maybe the FDA, and last and most remotely, Dr. Nichols. All he's doing is making it according to FDA regulations. He's not deciding who gives what dose to whom. That's your responsibility. I told Dave this, and he replied, I hope you know what you're doing. This is a real leap of faith for me and our lawyers. May and June involved finding laboratories to run the FDA-required tests on the DMT once it arrived. One test required the DMT to be sent out, and the first two laboratories I contacted refused to work with the Schedule I drug. Finally, a third company agreed to do the testing. By July 1990, Dave had made the drug and was running all the tests on it that the FDA needed to determine its identity and purity. It was nearly 100% pure. In early July, he sent 5 grams of DMT to my clinic by overnight courier. I kept it in my office that day and drove to the hospital pharmacy to deliver it before going home. I called Dr. W to tell him that the DMT had arrived and that it might take a few months to get all the tests performed and collect the results. He said, get everything together and send it to Ms. R, the chemist, and Ms. P. Call them a week later. They'll say they never saw your letter. Then call me in 2 weeks if you don't hear anything after that. Some poor guy got his approval and waited a month before we found someone to type the letter to him. The pharmacy prepared a solution of DMT dissolved in salt water. This was the form in which I would give DMT to the volunteers. The pharmacist divided it into 100 separate glass vials. The samples for the FDA's tests would come from them. I had a few last-minute questions and called Ms. R in September. We hadn't talked for a few months. I need to refresh my memory about your case, she said. After a few additional phone calls, she provided the necessary information. By late October, all the tests were complete, and the DMT passed every one. I put together my package and sent it to the FDA by overnight mail. I started calling within a week. No one replied to the dozen messages I left with the secretary. I phoned Dr. W. What's the matter? He asked. You usually call when things aren't going well. May I begin the DMT study? I'll just tootle on over there and find out what I can. I called back in early November. The secretary told me their division had changed offices, but that they came by every half hour to check for messages. On November 5th, 1990, Ms. M, my project officer, called at the end of the day. Your hold has been removed. Is a verbal okay all I need? Yes. The university won't accept that. Would you fax a letter? I asked. I'll fax one tomorrow. November in the mountains of New Mexico is cold and dry, windy and harsh. I made many of these phone calls from my house in the Manzano Mountains southeast of Albuquerque. I sometimes joked to friends that my applications had to be approved because my view was nicer than anyone's in D.C. My former wife's weaving studio was in a separate building about 15 yards from the main house. Hanging up the phone after that last conversation with Ms. M, I braced myself against the cold wind and slowly walked along the crunchy gravel path to the outbuilding to share the news. They said I could start. I lay down on the cold cement floor, staring up at the ceiling. That's great, dear, she replied, leaning down to ground level to kiss my cheek. I called every day for the next 10 days, asking for the fax. It arrived on November 15th. At the bottom of the handwritten fax, Ms. M wrote, "Have a happy Thanksgiving." That day, the university laboratory called to tell me the DMT in the glass vials had decomposed by 30%. It was too weak to use. I called the laboratory technician. "How did you calculate the concentration?" He answered, "By using the weight of free base DMT." "It's not free base. It's a salt." "Oh, I didn't know that." Let's see. That's right. It's the correct concentration after all. Sorry about that. 4 days later, I gave Philip the first dose of DMT. Part 3. Set, Setting, and DMT. 7. Being a volunteer. I obtained approval for the DMT research in late 1990, and soon, with Philip and Nils as my human guinea pigs, determined the best doses and manner of administering the drug. It now was time to begin recruiting volunteers. While I found many volunteers among my longtime friends, I needed to enlarge the pool of research subjects beyond personal acquaintances. I was reluctant to advertise. Such an announcement might have resulted in a flood of calls, and I did not have the time to speak to everyone with a casual interest. A public call for research subjects also might find its way to the local media and would draw unwanted attention. Upon considering recruiting UNM students, I remembered the trouble that Leary and his associates encountered at Harvard when they included undergraduates into their program. If I were to canvass the university for volunteers, they would need to be graduate students rather than the younger and less mature undergraduates. I also wanted to include no more than one representative from any department. Leary's research at Harvard had created cliques of drug-taking graduate students. These students
Alright, that's discernible, but it's still not quite as pronounced as I would like the light and the shadow to be on the trees. So I'll probably do a slightly lighter green and a slightly lighter purple on top of that, or blue-violet. But for the moment, I think that's it. So thank you for watching. It's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion House, New Mexico, working on oil painting nurture. Pan it back and forth on those trees a little bit. Some pretty nice ultramarine
and 7 belonged to a social group to which I was introduced several years after the research began. The nearly 3 dozen remaining people found out about the study by word of mouth. They were friends of volunteers, received psychedelic newsletters describing the Albuquerque research, or just happened to be in a conversation during which the studies were discussed.
That line, I think, or that
For the sake of
blend
convenience,
of the yellow, I think
I
adds a
will
lot of
invent
depth to the
hypothetical
horizon.
volunteer
It's
named
nice.
Alex, a 32-year-old
And sort of a
married male
unifying
who worked as a
stripe
software programmer outside
throughout
of
the
Santa
entire
Fe.
composition.
Since most of our research subjects were men, I hope no one is put off by making our generic volunteer male.
Okay.
Alex's
Have a good day,
first
Eric.
step was to make a phone call to my office.